A brilliant genetic engineer's creation of a joyful plant backfires when an unexpected mutation grants it a strange effect towards humans, spreading rapidly undetected. Alice Woodard is at her company's greenhouse, showcasing her plant genetically engineered to make its owner happy. She explains that its scent triggers the production of oxytocin, acting as a mood-lifting and antidepressant agent. Carl, her senior, announces that it's the first of its kind that's fit for commercial availability. Meanwhile, Joe, Alice's son, watches the cameras, observing his mother work. Chris, having finished his part in the presentation, returns to the office and sees Joe, complimenting the boy's new shoes. At home, Joe tells his mother that Chris obviously likes her, but she's too engrossed in her plans to notice. He says that they'd make a better match than his father. Alice, taken aback, informs him that his dad has requested they spend the upcoming weekend together. Joe jokingly accuses her of wanting to get rid of him so she can work more. The following day, Alice attends therapy and discusses her recent accomplishments at work. However, she acknowledges the unpredictability in her field and that she can't control everything. Alice then opens up about her close relationship with her son, while also sharing her fears of something happening to him when she isn't around. Later at work, Bella waits for Carl so she can enter the greenhouse along with her dog, Bello. Once Carl arrives, she begins feeding the blue flowers called Flash 2s they've been cultivating, expressing her confidence that the new plants will fare better than the red flowers called Flash 1s. Nearby, Chris fumbles his attempt at asking Alice out, and the engineer awkwardly rejects him. After work, Alice smuggles one of the red engineered plants home and shows it to Joe while he tends to his ant colony. Taken aback by the breach of protocol, the engineer assures him that it's alright as long as no one knows. She instructs that it needs a lot of care and attention. Then they affectionately name the red plant LittleJoe and warmly welcome it into their home. The following day, Chris and Rick discover the greenhouse filled with pollen. Because of this, the condition of the Flash 2s have suddenly deteriorated. During a subsequent meeting, Carl questions why LittleJoe released so much pollen, which he believes is responsible for the decline of his Flash 2s. Alice speculates that the pollen could be a reaction to the plant's infertility. Jasper raises suspicions about Alice's methods, insinuating that she used prohibited techniques to achieve such results. He points out that while the new virus vectors are effective, they're still controversial. However, Alice denies any wrongdoing. Bella interjects, stating that it's unnatural for a plant to be sterile, since reproduction is one of life's purposes, declaring that LittleJoe will find a way to reproduce. Carl, however, is more concerned about the potential allergens in the pollen and mandates face masks. Later, Rick plays with Bello while Bella and Carl lament the loss of their Flash 2s. Meanwhile, in the locker room, Chris once again asks Alice for a drink after work. Surprisingly, she agrees, but before they can leave, Bella asks for help in finding Bello. She requests someone to check the greenhouse, so Chris volunteers. He makes his way to the greenhouse where the LittleJoes begin to bloom. Suddenly, Bello jumps on Chris, causing him to inhale a significant amount of pollen. Shaking off the incident, he heads back. Later at a pub, Alice mentions that Joe believes they make a good match. Chris, interpreting this as a sign, leans in for a kiss, but Alice pulls back. To alleviate the tension, the awkward man goes to fetch more beer. Upon his return, he attempts another kiss, and the woman politely slides away. The next day, Bella is disturbed by the sudden change in Bello, convinced that he's no longer the same dog. During lunch, Chris shares that Bella has a history of mental instability, despite previously being one of the company's top engineers. As Bella goes home, Alice witnesses her removing Bello's scarf. Meanwhile, at home, Joe is eager to impress Selma and decides to take a selfie with the unique plant. Unbeknownst to him, the plant slowly blossoms due to the attention he's given it. After watering and talking to LittleJoe, he takes a whiff of its scent, inadvertently inhaling too much pollen. When Alice arrives home, she finds her son unresponsive in front of the TV. The following day, Bella arrives alone to work, having had to put down her dog. After work, she visits Alice at home and presents a diagram, theorizing that LittleJoe's pollen travels from the nose directly to the part of the brain responsible for emotions, behavior, and personality. She suggests that's why Bella changed. Bella adds that she suspects Chris is infected as well, observing that he'd do anything to protect LittleJoe. Alice dismisses this, stating that she too would defend the plant. As Bella prepares to go, she leaves her colleague with a question about which of her children is more valuable. Once the guest departs, Alice retrieves LittleJoe. During her therapy session, Alice shares Bella's concerns, but ultimately dismisses them as an unstable woman projecting her own fears. When asked, she laughs off the idea of Chris being a romantic partner, stating that she's already preoccupied with her son. At work, Alice and Chris attend a meeting where Carl is furious over the additional LittleJoes despite the unfinished pollen tests. During this, Chris looks down guiltily. The senior emphasizes prioritizing safety over success, prompting the female engineer to assert that LittleJoe's pollen is harmless. She reveals that she has her own LittleJoe at home and hasn't experienced any allergic reactions. Carl threatens to halt further cultivation of the plant, but Chris argues that they need to prepare for the upcoming flower fair. The senior begrudgingly agrees, but reiterates that LittleJoe won't be available to the public until its safety is certified. Later, Alice rebukes Chris for acting on his own. Afterwards, Alice watches the interviews conducted as part of the pollen test. A girl loves its scent and claims no allergic reactions. However, her mother mentions a change in her daughter, leading the girl to describe herself as an observer in her own body. The interviews abruptly end, and Alice questions Rick about whether the video shows the complete interviews. Her colleague explains that he edited the footage because the participants rambled on. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Joe is with his father, Ivan. However, he remains distant as his father tries to initiate conversation. When Ivan mentions that they rarely spend time together, Joe hesitatingly mentions Selma. After dropping Joe off, Ivan remarks to Alice about their son changing, but attributes it to growing up. Inside the house, Alice brings up Ivan wanting Joe to live with him, but she states that she prefers them to stay together. Then, the son asks about their weekend plans, but his mom explains that she's busy preparing for the flower fair. Later that night, the mother finds herself unable to shake off Ivan's words and revisits Bella's diagram. When she falls asleep, Joe quietly takes her work keycard. Meeting up with his girlfriend Selma, Joe proudly shows her the greenhouse filled with LittleJoes. Aware of the security cameras, the boy holds her back before they begin exploring. Selma comments on the high temperature, and Joe explains that the unique plants need it that way. As she explores, her companion tells her that it's important to talk to them. Curious, Selma asks if they talk back, but before Joe could answer, they're distracted by the security cameras. They take cover beneath the plants, exposing themselves to the pollen. The following day, Carl notifies Alice that one of the LittleJoes is missing. Rick suggests the possibility of a competitor stealing it, but their senior is skeptical. As the camera pans, Alice spots Joe's shoe, though she refrains from mentioning it. Exiting the monitor room, Alice is unexpectedly confronted by her unstable colleague. While still skeptical, a growing part of her is beginning to believe the woman. Bella develops her theory, explaining that LittleJoe's method of reproduction is forcing humans to inhale its pollen, altering their personalities to care for it. Before leaving, she hands Alice a flash drive, advising her to act as if everything is normal. At home, the engineer discovers that the drive contains raw interviews of the pollen test. It reveals that participants changed immediately after the test. Some participants expressed an inability to recognize familiar individuals, while others' personalities were unrecognizable to loved ones. Alarmed, she checks on Joe, only to find Selma in his room. Trying to keep her composure, Alice invites her for dinner. As the evening progresses, she's blindsided when her son abruptly declares his desire to live with Ivan. The mother adamantly refuses, causing Joe and Selma to leave. Alice tries to stop her son and accidentally gets injured in the process, but Joe is indifferent to the situation, whereas Selma is oddly unfazed. Despite the altercation, the two go on to tend to LittleJoe, seemingly unaffected. The distraught mother's unease intensifies when she notices Joe's ant colony is now dead and abandoned. The next day, Rick is alarmed by the exposure of the LittleJoe seedlings to dangerously low temperatures. Suspicions lead Rick and Chris to confront Bella, accusing her of sabotaging the seedlings. During lunch, Alice confides in Chris about Bella's theories, and he dismisses them as paranoia. Alice then shares her fear that the virus vector used to engineer LittleJoe may have mutated to overcome its sterility. She regrets making LittleJoe sterile, but Chris reassures her that it was necessary to prevent uncontrolled spread of engineered plants. However, he's incredulous at the thought that people can be infected to only care about LittleJoe and be adept at hiding it. Chris suggests that there are more plausible reasons for people to change. Then, Alice confesses that she's just on the edge about her son and his abrupt change in behavior. Chris says her son is just growing up and offers to talk to Joe about it. That weekend, Alice elects to take a break and picks her son up from school. As they lock eyes, Joe excuses himself from his friends and starts walking away. The mother is choked, thinking he's intentionally avoiding her. Just then, Joe appears and explains that he didn't notice her. During their drive, Joe surprises her by saying he already has plans. Disappointed, the mother comments on how much he's changed and the feeling of not knowing him anymore. However, her son brushes it off, saying it's normal for his age. Meanwhile, at work, Rick asks Bella to cover for him due to an emergency. She agrees, and Rick hands over his keycard and the passcode. Once finished tending to his colleagues' duties in the greenhouse, Bella realizes that she's locked inside. Desperate to escape the surging pollen, she resorts to escaping through a window. The following day, Bella claims that her concerns were simply a result of her past mental instability. She reassures Alice that she's back on her medication and reveals that she inhaled some of the pollen with no adverse effects. Chris, who hurries to eavesdrop on them, seems glad to hear this news. This development leaves Alice more troubled than before. Overwhelmed, Alice visits her therapist unannounced. During the session, she opens up about her fears that both Bella and her son have been infected by LittleJoe. The therapist revisits her fear of losing Joe, suggesting that it's causing her to see evidence that confirms her fears. Upon returning home, the engineer is surprised to find Chris with Joe and Selma. Annoyed at this intrusion, she politely asks him to leave. At their doorstep, he awkwardly confesses his love, but Alice ignores it. He then says that there's nothing wrong with Joe and gaslights her, stating she's the one that's changed. With Chris gone, Alice confronts her son about their unauthorized entry into the greenhouse. Cornered, Joe confirms her fears that he and Selma have been infected by LittleJoe, and they intend to give a plant to Ivan, hoping to infect him too. He continues that there's nothing to fear, they're happy and no one notices that they're infected. Then he and Selma laugh when they compare it to the happiness of being dead. Eventually, Joe reveals that it's just a joke. Selma chimes in, mentioning that Chris had informed them about Alice's concerns. He assures his mother that he's still her Joe. He's just going through puberty and wants to spend time with his dad. Later that night, Alice finds her son standing near LittleJoe. She hugs him, declaring her unconditional love as her son stands there catatonic. The next day, Alice confesses to Carl about her use of prohibited virus vectors in her project. She adds that the virus might have mutated, infiltrating human brains and manipulating them into an obsessive attachment to LittleJoe's well-being. Alice explains that instead of happiness, it's causing an indifference towards everything unrelated to the plant. Contrary to Carl's previous reactions, this time he takes the confession lightly, but agrees to have LittleJoe's DNA tested. Later at the greenhouse, Bella comes across Bello's toy, and she starts breaking down in tears. During lunch, Bella announces that she didn't inhale the pollen, and that aside from her, they're all infected like Bello. As people start ridiculing her, Alice tries to get her to sit down. As Carl attempts to escort Bella to the doctor, she flees, prompting Carl and Chris to give chase. Concerned, Alice follows, but Rick blocks her path. When Alice catches up, she hears Bella struggle, followed by a thud as she falls from a railing. The men claim they tried to stop her, but it was unavoidable. Afterwards, Carl announces that Bella's currently fighting for her life, but they must carry on, considering the impending flower fair. He congratulates Alice's team and reports that tests have shown LittleJoe to have no allergens to be worried about. He then addresses Alice, dismissing the idea of testing LittleJoe's DNA, claiming it's in their best interest to cover her questionable methods of engineering. When Alice brings up the possibility of a widespread infection, Carl states that there's no evidence to support such claims. Contrary to his earlier sentiments, her senior now cares more about success than safety. Chris acknowledges the challenging day and offers his support. However, Alice insists that she's fine and leaves. Once she's gone, Carl and Chris share knowing glances. After working hours, Alice, wearing a mask, lowers the greenhouse temperature in an attempt to eliminate all the LittleJoes. However, Chris is still there and notices the chilly room. He tries to console her, but when that doesn't work, he starts accusing her of ending her own children. Still, the female engineer is unwilling to risk LittleJoe manipulating people. Chris tries snatching the thermostat key, resulting in a struggle. When Alice fends him off, he resorts to violent acts. With the woman unconscious, he returns the temperature to normal for LittleJoe. He then removes Alice's mask and leaves her there as the strange plants release its pollen. Sometime later, Carl announces that LittleJoe has been nominated for a prestigious award, and they've been receiving orders from schools and hospitals across Europe. He adds that with the nomination, they might even start receiving international orders. Rick pops open a bottle of champagne and Carl extends his congratulations to Alice for her successful project. Afterward, Chris privately apologizes for what happened that night. Unexpectedly, Alice brushes it off and says they're a team, leaning in for a kiss. Later at home, Alice suggests to Joe that he can move in with Ivan if he still wants to. She explains that it's also time for her to learn how to live without him. The following day, she drops off her son at Ivan's place. Having done that, Alice goes to her therapy session and expresses how foolish she feels for entertaining the idea that LittleJoe could infect people, even altering a mother's love for her child. When her therapist asks what altered her perspective, Alice explains that subconsciously, she wanted Joe to live with Ivan. She recognizes that her son needs a father figure in his life, and she also desired more time to focus on her work. The therapist supports her patient's response, emphasizing the importance of embracing one's true self. As Alice leaves, she notices the receptionist admiring their newly acquired LittleJoe. Back at home, she says goodnight to her own LittleJoe, and it responds with its own goodnight. Ultimately, manipulated or not, Alice made her decision regarding which Joe she wanted by her side.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.